Okay, well, thank you. I want to be very brief in the introduction of the book and to discuss the book in a broad sense, so that I know a lot of you are studying Middle Eastern politics and almost all of you are studying international relations. And so I want to give you a little bit of a context as to why I decided to write about Bahrain. I'm not Bahraini, but much like you, I've been very interested in the Middle Eastern region. So, but nonetheless, most people are selecting other crisis areas and conflict areas, and even socio-political and economic issues related to the Middle East. Very often you talk about energy security of the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict, even the history of conflict between, for instance, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, or Turkey's role, or Iran's role, or Israel's role within regional security. Very few people are focusing on small states, and in some ways it's one of the reasons and one of the main focuses that I've been looking at in terms of international relations over the past couple of years is not the role of the big powers, but the role of the small states. And it all occurred to me several years ago when looking at the case of Belgium before the eruption of World War I. Because what was Belgium at the time? It was a neutral country. And in some ways, the balance of power system within Europe relied on Belgium being neutral. If it had joined one of the other blocs, it would have triggered like a series of events, which ultimately, as we saw, would lead to conflict. And so when the German state started to kind of force Belgium, or tried to put pressure on Belgium, and the Belgians responded by mobilizing their military, it sent the entire European subsystem into a state of chaos. It's the same thing that's happened in the Middle East. You have a very small country, Bahrain, which cannot afford on one side to be neutral because it's too vulnerable, it's too small. And on the other hand, you have many regional powers, and in some cases even international powers, which are looking at this very important geostrategic location, the Arabian Gulf, where some ridiculous amounts, like 70% of the world's hydrocarbons, are sailing through the Arabian Gulf into the rest, or to the international marketplace. And so it's such an attractive place. You have so much penetration of the world's powers. You had the Soviets there. You had in antiquity, you had, not antiquity, but in antiquity you had the Persian Empire, which had extended a degree of control over the region. You've had Britain, of course, you've had Portugal, you've had the Netherlands, you've had Saudi Arabia, the United States, all the world powers throughout history. As long as they've had some kind of projection, they've entered into the Arabian Gulf. Of course, not only because of hydrocarbons, that's more of a 20th century phenomenon. But nonetheless, for other strategic, either resources or positioning, the Arabian Gulf has just been one of those places that the great world powers are trying to enter into. And so this book was based out of a realization which starts after the so-called Arab Spring erupted in 2010, 2011. Because here, my training has been always in strategic thought and in international relations theory. And then all of a sudden, you're testing the Middle East, you test your theories in what's gone on in the Levant and in North Africa. And all of a sudden, you have in the Arab Spring, all of a sudden you have revolutions, demonstrations, and a new kind of global awareness of the importance of social media and technologies in the Arab world. So to kind of see that they are not only interacting with the wider international community, but that also they are affecting in many ways each other and the international environment. And then I saw the situation in Bahrain unfold. And for me, it was very striking because what I did know about Bahrain, and although I hadn't been there until that point, but what I had known about Bahrain is that it was a very tolerant and open society that had been under tremendous amount of strain from the larger external powers, particularly countries like Iran, but also in generations before, the Omani, when Oman was the regional power, Oman pressured Bahrain. Of course, the Al Saud in the beginning of the 19th century had also tried to enter into Bahrain. And so it's not only Iran, of course, But Iran is just the most recent country which has been trying to extend its influence into Bahrain as a way, almost a gateway of extending its influence onto the western side of the Arabian Gulf and into the Arabian Peninsula. And so when I saw the violence erupt on television in 2000 and I guess 2011, when you had the kind of the occupation of what's now known as the Pearl Roundabout, but officially it was called the GCC Roundabout. It is the GCC Roundabout. Of course, in the discourses which are raised and the narratives which are spoken about, if you're on either an opposition side or not opposition side, they're referring very often to this by different names. And one of the names, of course, is the Pearl Roundabout, but it's not actually the Pearl Roundabout. It was the GCC Roundabout. And of course, what's in a name? You ask yourself what's in a name, but in fact, everything is in a name. And it's been very competitive over the past 2 years in trying to get an idea across in the international media, which would then present, let's say, the crisis and the series of crises which have followed afterwards in a particular light. And so I took on the task of a social scientist when I was looking at the situation in Bahrain, and I thought, okay, here's a small country which has been facing these wider external challenges basically since the birth of the state. And the state was born, by the way, in 1783. Basically the current configuration of the state was 1783, and it's carried on from 1783 until our own time. So in some ways, in terms of the historical depth of the country, it rivals many of the European countries, in fact, which either broke out of the larger empires or managed to steer their own way through the trials and tribulations of European life. Because to draw a parallel, Europe was also a very dangerous region. It's not always been, in this kind of nice, stable, maybe, I don't even know how to describe it, but a nice, stable period of history, an era of history that we face now. A country like Luxembourg, or even small countries, principalities, for instance, like Liechtenstein, or even Switzerland for that matter, have had to kind of also steer their way through very delicate political situations in the past. And that's why understanding something like Bahrain is much more than understanding just another Arab country in another kind of revolutionary state. There must be some other kind of regional pressures which have guided Bahrain in the decisions that it has taken and that its leadership has taken in order to best secure its future. And so again, to go back to this Arab Spring and the events that unfolded around the Arab Spring, I asked the social scientist question of to what extent was external pressure responsible for internal upheaval? And the answer, when I started to travel there, and I had started to travel there already in 2011, almost immediately after the occupation of this GCC roundabout. And there I saw with my own eyes, and in the book I managed to get 14 color photographs that I had taken and have them inside the book, where you see a different story that unfolds than if you were to read, for example, the mainstream press. Because the mainstream press would have you believe that you have two groups within the society, that you have a Sunni group and a Shia group. You would also read that the Shia group, and in fact most scholarship as well, would also go through this. I went over about 50 books that are supposed to give you a general history and kind of strategic assessments of the Gulf states and the Middle Eastern states in general. And what I found is that Bahrain is almost never assessed. It's always treated as part of a larger list, or it's treated in a way instrumentally. It's used as a way to demonstrate somebody else's point, but it's never really focused on itself. So that was one of the hurdles I faced actually in the research, is that many researchers on the Middle East just pay attention to it in passing, not as a main focus. But to get back to it, when you start to read the narratives that have been adopted in the international press, and you start to see that it's a Sunni leadership and a Shia majority, and that's it. There's no more explanation. Nobody tells you, for example, that almost every major family in the country intermarries, that the Shia and Sunni are intermarried, or, for example, that you have somebody who's one of the opposition leaders in Bahrain, Nabil Rajab, that his cousin is Samira Rajab. So, and Samira Rajab is right now a minister in the country, and one of the opposition members is Nabil Rajab, and they're from the same family. So it's total nonsense to assume that within this society you would have one class which is anti-government and one class which is supporting government. And so when you get there and you see that the nuances of political and social life are just much more intricate than what you would have as this black and white story, it begs more and more questions. And so I spent considerable amount of time. I got a lot of support from my university to do so, to go over to Bahrain and to, well, basically to write this book. And the book blends together things, more of an academic approach, as well as polemics, because I think it's important once you've started to engage with a particular society and you start to explore and look politically under the surface, under just the newspapers or under the opposition versus government, the debates and discussions. If you start to go a bit deeper, you start to feel, as a social scientist, a sense of responsibility for making sure that your story is told, because you've done that research and you're not just going to give into some kind of shallow treatment of the work. And so what started off for me as an idea to write an article, and then it transformed into a book, and then it's kind of dominated my life for the past year and a bit. But now, as I go over it and I find those few spelling mistakes that are still hidden in the work, because no matter how many times you review it, there's always going to be a few. I won't tell you what pages they're on, but you go over it again and you start to think, well, there is something to be said about this. That a country like Bahrain has managed, despite all the odds that are really stacked against it, it's really managed to survive an almost impossible situation in terms of internal combustion, right, and external manipulation in order to get that combustion off the ground. And of course, we don't point fingers of blame as international relations scholars. We try to find reasonable solutions to the types of problems that are unfolding there. And then when you start to see, and in my explorations of Bahrain, you see that since the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that there's been a renewed, and I say renewed because it doesn't start with the Islamic Revolution in Iran, it predates it. The Shah of Iran only relinquishes claims to Bahrain because the Iranian state, the Persian state before, claims that Bahrain is the 14th province of Iran. And so they actually say that it's their territory, and they have done so since the 19th century. It was quite funny for me to go back into the history books and to see the basis of the claims, because the basis of the claims, if somebody were to tell you this today, or to properly articulate it today, you would think that it's ludicrous. Because, for example, one of the reasons that the Iranians claim Bahrain is because of a low-ranking British official at the time had made a side deal with a low-ranking prince within the Persian Empire, saying that Bahrain is yours. And as soon as the British government found out about it, they recalled him, forced him to publicly say that he was not in a position to make that claim. But still, that one episode has become such an important feature in Iran's discourses ever since. So they say that Britain recognizes the sovereignty of Iran over Bahrain, right? So that was one of the main arguments, and it resurfaced, right? And it's been resurfacing ever since. Then they found some strange gold coins. They found some in an excavation. Also in the end of the 19th, early 20th century, they found a satchel of gold coins, which apparently were minted in Bahrain, but they were Persian coins. And so now the Iranians, until today, the Iranian states, and of course there's a distinction to be made between Iranian people and the Iranian state. But when the Iranian state claims Bahrain, they again cite this gold bag of coins that they found. And they say this is evidence that Bahrain was once part of the Persian Empire and therefore should be again part of the Persian Empire. And every archaeologist has said that the coins are complete fabrications, that 100 years ago they were put there for precisely that reason. And then there are other things, like the fact that some people call it the Persian Gulf. And one of the Ayatollahs in 2009, one of the Ayatollah's advisors rekindles this claim to Bahrain by stating that it's the Persian Gulf and the international community recognizes it as the Persian Gulf, and that means that everything inside the Persian Gulf is Persian. And that was the logic that was being deployed in 2009 by the advisor, a man named Al-Nouri, to the Grand Ayatollah. And so you can see that, and you can try to imagine as a very small country like Bahrain, if you hear a very large country like Iran claiming your territory, it's going to cause a little bit of anxiety in decision-making circles. And it's one of the main reasons why each year Bahrain, the Kingdom of Bahrain, is constantly going on a diplomatic front to try to reignite or to reinforce the relationship that Bahrain enjoys with the United States, with the United Kingdom, as well as within the GCC, because it's terrified when a big country, 83 million people, 82 million people, massive country like Iran claims sovereignty over such a small territory. I mean, after all, it's like 700 square kilometers. It's really minuscule. And within the book and from the research of the book, you start to realize just how vulnerable Bahrain is and how sensitive it is to these kind of changes in the political tensions which are unfolding within the region. And essentially that's what the book is about. Of course, I try to do it I try to present theoretical foundations for it as well, which is very important for us because we don't want to jump in as scholars into this kind of more shallow discussions about countries and debates about changing societies and changing roles within societies. And so I tried to develop kind of an appreciation for what is a small state in general without having to look only at Bahrain. So that's the model that gets developed is applicable to other small states as well. And in this way, I developed something like relatively small versus absolutely small, where a relatively small country is roughly 10% of the size of one of its neighbors. And so within that relationship, you could say that it would be relatively small. Now, small is also a demographic and a geographic issue, because you have to have a degree of territoriality when you're discussing the size. I mean, Canada, for example, its population may be less than 10% of the United States population, but its territory is, comparable. In fact, it's larger than the United States. So I don't think it would be a fair assessment to say that Canada is a small country, a relatively small country. Then you would have something like an absolute determinant of being small. And there you would have to have a population of less than 1 million citizens of the country. And again, a country like Bahrain has about 570,000 nationals and an additional 600,000 expatriate workers, not only from India and Pakistan, but also United Kingdom, United States, other European countries, GCC countries who are living there and who are part of society, but they are not citizens. So you're talking about roughly 560,000 citizens of the state. In Europe, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, also these are less than 500. I think Luxembourg is about 500,000 now. I always use the example, by the way, of Luxembourg because it's probably the closest, it resembles closest Bahrain in Europe. It's also got a constitutional monarch as the head of state. It's a country which used to rely on natural resources like Bahrain did. Bahrain, by the way, is not an energy producing state anymore to the same level as it once was. It used to be a very big energy producer. It was one of the first countries that they discovered oil in the Arabian Gulf anyways, 1931. And it was in 1931, of course, when the United Kingdom identifies Bahrain as a strategic asset, a strategic partner, and not just a kind of location for it to base its fleets in. As a policing enterprise, believe it or not, in the slave trade, in the piracy trade. in combating piracy and combating slavery in the Gulf region. And so Bahrain, like Luxembourg, neither of them are producing anything substantially anymore in terms of a resource base. And they've had to start focusing their economy and as a result their society on other projects. Luxembourg has the benefit and had the benefit of having its two biggest rivals basically knocked out of international politics during the 20th century, because the Germans, for example, once they were defeated, they could no longer put the amount of pressure onto Luxembourg. And by the way, similar to Bahrain, Luxembourg was also being claimed by the Third Reich, by the Nazis, as being a Germanic territory. And actually it was quite devastating when the Nazi Germans occupy what they claimed as their territory, because they basically sent all the young men to fight on the Russian front, knowing that the Russians wouldn't be able to distinguish between a German speaker and a Luxembourgish speaker. So they just sent them, and most of them, of course, don't come back, sorry, they die. And so it gives a kind of lesson of how small states have been teaching each other in some ways about how to survive. And Luxembourg has managed to survive. It's done very well for itself, and in many ways Bahrain is looking at the examples of other small states. They also look at the failures of some small states, countries like Cyprus, for example. Cyprus during the 1974 conflict, where you have the Turkish intervention in the north of Cyprus, and now you have de facto a split island. And so the Bahrainis have also looked at the countries which didn't manage to survive as small states, and they're learning these lessons. So it became very complicated for the Bahrainis to try to deal with making those kind of decisions for their people, because ultimately that's what leadership is supposed to do, is ensure the survivability of your state and your people. Of course, it's we have to think about the ethics of doing this, and what are the consequences and of different strategies that are adopted. But ultimately, that's what the goal of the Bahraini state is. It's not about appeasing, let's say, the international community. It's the opposite. It's about ensuring the survival of their state, of their nation. And so it has become like a very difficult process for Bahrain to balance between ensuring the safety and security of their state and their people, and at the same time trying to explain the situation that they're facing as being this small state in a dangerous region, trying to deal with the immense pressures that are coming from outside actors. Of course, the other thing to try to deal with intellectually in the work was about what classifies a region as being a dangerous region, because it's also an intellectual question that in some ways justifies political behaviors. Very often you'll find that decision makers anywhere in the world, in fact, will exaggerate a certain challenge that's facing the state, because once a population feels that there is a threat or there is a challenge regionally, so they'll give much more powers to the state to take care of it for them. And so it's been very important to distinguish between exaggerated challenges, exaggerated threats, and those which are real. And when you combine, for instance, in the Arabian Gulf, when you combine the facts that you have all these hydrocarbons, you have a lot of external penetration, so the great powers are trying to get in for control of the seaways, as well as to dominate the actual resource base in the Arabian Gulf. Then you have the local powers, which you have something like resource scarcity as well as resource abundance, which is facilitating this. So for example, in the Middle East, you have a lack of fresh water and you have a lack of arable land, which means that you have to import certain things. And so you're looking for outside partners anyways to enter in. And what do you offer them? Well, you offer energy, or you offer basing rights, so that they can take the hydrocarbons out and bring in your other vital resources, the water and the food and things of that nature. And so you have a region where you have resource scarcity and very important strategic resource abundance. Then you're talking about it being at something like a geopolitical crossroads, because it's a very important place between Africa, for example, or proximate to Africa, on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula. Then you've got the peninsula in the middle. On the other side, you have the gateways into Asia, right? You have Iran, which kind of bleeds its way into Pakistan and India. You've got access in the Indian Ocean, and it's a very strategic and important part. And so then you start to really almost conceptualize the kinds of challenges that are being faced by a country like Bahrain and other countries and some of the other small countries in the region as well, because the region is dominated by a couple of large states, right? You have Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iraq used to be also a great power extending itself. And then the other states, Kuwait, for example, is relatively small. Qatar, Bahrain, and then the Emirates. And the Emirates also serve, just as I'm thinking about it, they also serve as an example of some of the hegemonic aspirations or regional hegemonic aspirations of some of the powers there, because in 1971, so the Iranian armed forces, again this is before the revolution, they occupy 3 islands of the United Arab Emirates. They're called the Abu Musa Islands, and then you have the upper and lower Tanub Islands. And it's also been very interesting to explore these islands because they've become militarized. So the Iranians didn't just take them as part of their territory, but they installed considerable amounts of military machinery, equipment on those islands. And it looks almost like a strategic placement around this Strait of Hormuz, where all the traffic is going back and forth regarding the transportation of energy as well as the food importation that the Gulf states need. I hope that's kind of enough as like an overview of the story of the book. It's more or less what the book is focusing on. Just to kind of give you a little bit of breakdown of the chapters, I have an excessively long preface. It looks at some of the theories. It's like, I think maybe 50 pages as a preface, because it brings forward some of the theories related to Bahrain, and it deals with a little bit of the criticisms of the book, because I know more or less the kinds of criticisms that I'm going to face with this book. It's a very polarizing book, and I understand that it's been a polarizing exercise for me to get involved in Bahrain and to start researching Bahrain. It's been quite an experience. I've pre-released some of the chapters and subsections within it as articles, and the amount of hate mail that I get and threats that I get has just been, well, it's been encouraging. I guess it shows that you can actually have an impact as a scholar, which has been quite nice as well. I don't want to put you off. I think scholarship is very, very important. But on average, a scholarly article is read something like 17 times from cover to cover. And a scholarly book, a little bit less on average, of course. There are some which are just, fantastic, fantastically quoted and used time and time again. But on average, an academic text is, I think, about 12 or 14 times read cover to cover. So you don't have that kind of how can you say, impact typically. Of course, that doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying to have that impact as scholars, but nonetheless it's much more difficult. And so it was quite encouraging to find that so many people were writing terrible things about me. At least it was some kind of reaction. And so I understood that it was a very polarizing book, and so I tried to deal with that in the preface to show the line of thinking that the work is going to be based on, as well as to kind of preempt some of the criticisms that have been coming out in the articles I had written before, just to deal with that. And then the first substantive chapter provides a longer history of Bahrain, just the way that it's developed as a state, and looks a little bit inside the decision-making process, especially as the United Kingdom came to be the protectorate of Bahrain in the beginning of the 19th century. And that followed, by the way, an intervention of the Omanis and the Saudis, which actually occupied Fort Arad, which is one of the main forts within Bahrain, and they installed themselves there. But then ultimately they lost one battle, and they were pushed out. And then Bahrain panicking, so it kind of invited the United Kingdom to base itself and to protect it. And so it started that kind of 200-year engagement with with Bahrain. Actually, right now, if you watch the press, you'll see that they're celebrating the relationship, and there's an old-style London double-decker bus kind of driving around Bahrain to kind of shore up this long-term relationship that they've had together. 200 odd years of this mutual. Yeah, I guess it's been a mutual relationship. It's not just been. Bahrain was never a colony of Britain. They never had. Of course, they ceded control over foreign affairs, but domestic affairs was Bahrain's decision. Then I start getting within the book. Then I have the theoretical work, which deals with small states and what it is to be a small state in a dangerous region. The third chapter is huge also, but it's about conflict bargaining, and it's adopting on some of the security literature that deals with conflict bargaining within crisis situations. And then it proposes all the different challenges that are being faced by Bahrain, both internal challenges, external challenges, and what you call like challenges of friendship, the challenges that are associated with the actions or inactions of your allies. And so I start looking a little bit at that. And then, of course, that brings into a whole section of alliances of the United States and British relationship to Bahrain, and then ultimately the Gulf Cooperation Council and the importance of that kind of security architecture, which has been developing in and along the Arabian Gulf on the western side, and what that means for a small state like Bahrain, because you'll find that Bahrain has been one of the biggest promoters of regional integration. And again, you'll find the parallel is drawn with Luxembourg, as after World War II, what was Luxembourg but the engine of European integration. And so Bahrain does the same. It tries to get the GCC countries together to build something like a union, like a Gulf union, similar to what the European Union has become. And then I wrap up with the kind of opportunities that Bahrain has socially, internally, and also internationally. So of course, the whole book is almost painting like a very bleak picture of this small country trying to deal with all the circumstances and being treated instrumentally by the great powers around it. But on the other hand, what it tries to do at the end is show that it's not all lost. It's not all like a negative situation. To be small in such a place also offers a tremendous amount of opportunities. And that's basically I think that's the big picture of what the book is and what it does. And of course, I'm happy to be able to launch it and to present it here at NTU. And of course, to take any questions from the audience. I really hope that that's enough of an overview. If you want, I can talk more specifically about things, or just to answer questions if you may have them.
Manner?
Okay. Thank you very much. In terms of this relationship between, let's say, we can make a triangular relationship of politics, society, and stability. It's always been, I think, an important question to ask in any decision-making body is, to what extent do we allow reform, for example, within any state, to be from a bottoms-up approach or from a top-down approach? And I think what we've seen in Bahrain is that you have different almost pressures within the society. Some that say what we need to do is kind of start the reform process from the above. Because, I mean, let's face it, all political communities are reforming all the time. You reform to adapt to our times and to the technologies that we have available, and to just the changing nature of our societies. Societies change, that's what they do. In a place like Bahrain, so the question has been, like here as well, you know, do we want to initiate policies and get people to change this way? To what extent is that going to affect, you know, political stability at home? Alternatively, do we allow kind of reform to be something from the bottom, and then it affects the system this way? And here you're going to see that a lot of the instability has been because of the inability of reaching a conclusion on what is the best policy, because they've dabbled in both directions. When you try to initiate policy, you'll have resistance. When that resistance is reinforced, for example, by an outside power, In this case, at times, and I don't mean it always, of course, you also had trade union conflicts in Bahrain starting in the 1920s. It's not only political. But when it becomes political and you get a country like Iran, which sees a disenfranchised group because of a top-down approach, then you'll get Molotov cocktails. And when you have a Molotov cocktail being thrown, for example, at a police station or a government office, then what it's going to do is further polarize the society and make instability that much more likely. Alternatively, and so this kind of going back and forth saying, okay, this works, this doesn't work, has also inspired, let's say, some external actors that have their own agendas to try to almost manipulate that situation. And I think we've seen that more and more over the past 2 years than we had in the previous almost 20 years before. Because typically what had happened previously, because 2011 is not the first time when there's some kind of attempt by an outside power to kind of overthrow or let's say to challenge the kingdom. You also had it starting in 1981, and you had it throughout the 80s and into the 1990s. But before, those were always real cell-oriented groups. They were very clearly adopting the Iranian ideology, but now it's different. Now it's groups that are being manipulated in some ways. And then there is a larger context of people who have legitimate grievances, who go to the streets for legitimate reasons, but then those kind of demonstrations of let's say, well, yeah, those demonstrations get hijacked by those people who have been manipulated. So you do have a very important instability which is being brought by trying to change your reform patterns within society. But it's also a good topic to further explore, I think. I didn't choose Bahrain. Essentially, Bahrain chose me. No, it was quite funny because I wrote just on my own a reflection article of about 14 pages, which details the attempts of Iran at overthrowing Bahrain from 1981. So in 1981, by the way, the same year that the GCC is formed, you had a group called the IFLB, which stands for the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain. It was very clearly an Iranian theocratic movement. They had appointed an Ayatollah to take over Bahrain. And so when the violence started in 2011, I went back into the history books and I broke out the archives, and I wanted to see how long there's been, what kind of political situation there was. And so I wrote this 14-page article which really traced from 1981 right up until basically 1999, 2000, when you had the King Hamid came to power, and he had a tremendous amount of political reforms took place within the country. And you saw so much instability in those years. And so this 14-page article, and one day the Wall Street Journal, who had been very much involved and very, let's say they were covering the Arab Spring events really very keenly. And so I got an email asking me if I was able to reduce this 14-page article into 800, 900 words. And if you want to talk about challenges, this was one of the most absurd questions that anybody had ever asked me. How do you take a 14-page article and turn it into less than 1,000 words? And then, so I did it, and they published it later in 2011. And it became one of the most widely read articles within the span of about a month. And there were like 7 or 8 million people who read it, which is where all the death threats and things came from. And of course, I started to really panic, because you read a lot of the comments and people are attacking you, and they attack you, they write articles about you, and they attack you, and they attack you, and you're thinking like, but if only you would have read the 14 pages, I would have been able to explain it. It's not my fault that they told you, okay, you have 1,000 words, not even 1,000 words, you have less than 1,000 words. Get the same idea that you wrote in 14 pages into 1,000 words. And then the people were wondering, well, why didn't he develop this idea more? And do you guys have any idea what it's like to take 14 pages and turn it into 900 words? I mean, it was impossible. So it's not to justify, but it's a very hard, big challenge that happened. And from there, I felt, I'm a very stubborn person anyways. And so after the initial kind of you know, the adrenaline goes up every time you turn on the computer and there's a new email. You just start sweating a bit. But then after it became something like, I don't know, I kind of wanted it a little bit more. And so some of the people who were writing kind of really scathing attacks about my work. So then I responded and I wrote more articles. And then I just decided, okay, this kind of tit for tat stuff of article back, forth, it's a bit boring. So I'm going to try to apply and get some support from our university to get a book out, because that's going to be much better. And so then it allowed me more time to travel, firstly, to Bahrain. Secondly, I got to meet all kinds of different people in Bahrain. I was quite fortunate. I mean, nobody ever came with me when I did interviews and talked to people. I was really free to do as I wanted, and which is it also speaks a lot for the country. And I was able to really compile a series of interviews and discussions, and got a lot of photographs. The photographs in the book are my photographs, and I have about I don't know, like 4,000 or 5,000 photographs, which I still keep. So if anybody's interested in actually the events in March 2011, I have all of them. Really one picture after the next picture, which I took from, at the beginning it was a little bit, well, as you can imagine, doing field work, because this is one of the challenges. There's field work, and then there's field work when you have to dodge, you know, mobs of people with sticks and police shooting tear gas and stuff like this. And so I took refuge on the rooftop of my hotel, which overlooks a street called Government Avenue. And from there you can kind of zoom in, and you had basically, this is where most of the violence unfolded. And so I was able to do it this way. So in terms of challenges, that's what it is. The challenge of course, you know, I don't want anything physically to happen to me. And when you write something which has been kind of picked up as being against a particular group, and then they start threatening you, it doesn't feel that nice at all. Research-wise, I had no problem with access, even to access opposition members and former opposition members. There's been no problem at all. Of course, I couldn't talk to Hezbollah. I don't think that they were that keen to talk to me. I didn't even try, to be honest. Maybe that's my failing. But I'll tell you why I didn't try. There's one group which is newly established in Bahrain, about 2 years. It's called Sacred Defense Bahrain. And they scare me. I mean, I actually am scared. They do these. They wrote about me on one of their web pages that I'm a bad person to read, and from there I am actually afraid of them. So I wouldn't say like, hey, let's go have coffee and let's talk. You know, I just think that would be a bad move. So those are really the challenges that I'm facing. Of all the countries in the Gulf, and probably, I mean, there's of course a huge European interest in the Gulf, because you have, again, you have the energy resources, and you have a history of relations. But of all the countries, I know that, as a matter of fact, that Bahrain is probably the most sought after destination because of the way that the society is. Because it's very free, in the sense that if you are a European and you want to go for a drink, for example, you're entitled to go for a drink. And unlike Saudi Arabia, where women have to be mandatorily wearing a headscarf, and they cannot drive, as you know, the whole movement of driving. You know, in contrast to that, Bahrain, it's free. If a woman wants to wear a skirt, she can wear a skirt. If she wants to wear a hijab or a headscarf, she can. It's up to her. And so people, and Saudis are also, by the way, going over to Bahrain, 250,000 every weekend. And they go over for them every weekend, yeah? So remember, I told you the country has 560,000 people. And every weekend, you add another 250,000 tourists from Saudi Arabia, which is one of the most amazing things to see, because they drive like 100 miles an hour from the border across the bridge, because they can't wait. The girls are, you know, they can't wait to learn how to drive or go to the cinema or eat together in a restaurant, yeah, or in some cases to go to a bar. or to go to a party, or to go swimming, or whatever it is. And so it's pretty remarkable. And so with this kind of, and it's become like this, so Qataris are going there, Kuwaitis, and of course Europeans who are living in Qatar, in Saudi, in Kuwait, they're also going to Bahrain. So it's become, in this way, quite important place, let's say, that when you're working in the oil business, or you're working in some of the other fields in adjacent countries, so you're going to go to Bahrain anyways. In terms of, let's say, the importance of Bahrain in the eyes of a European, it's relatively low. They don't know very much about the country. If you're not in the region, or if you're not focused on the region, Bahrain for you, not for you, but for people in general, is just another Arab country from the Gulf. And you started to see, when I talk to people in Brussels, they have the same impression. Very few of them have actually gone over to Bahrain, because when you go to the region, you go somewhere else. You go to Iraq, or you go to Iran, or these places. And so there's been a general, I think, lack of knowledge about Bahrain and the importance historically of Bahrain to some European countries. And not all European embassies are represented in Bahrain, and Bahrain doesn't have representation in all European countries. It's simply too small. And so for example, in Czech Republic, we have no representation of Bahrainis, and so I had a very difficult time in Bahrain, in Czech Republic, in being able to get comments from Bahrainis, because actually they're just too far away. And so, here in London there's, of course, in Brussels there is, in Germany, in Paris, which these are missions that I know for sure exist. But yeah, for something more than that, I think it's also, yeah, the chances are pretty low that Bahrain is going to rise in its importance by itself. But as a GCC, which is probably why the Bahrainis are pushing for the GCC Union, is because that's going to increase their importance. For all of Europe, in fact. But again, I think it's interesting, because you have so many opportunities for companies and countries, even tourism of Central, East Europeans, South Europeans, to go and have a different experience in the Gulf, because not all the countries are the same, of course. So there could be some opportunities there.